Good morning. I want to call this hearing to order. Mr. Secretary, thank you for joining us today, and I truly appreciate your commitment to your job and to our veterans while you are recovering from foot surgery. Out of respect and sympathy, I'm starting this meeting right on the dot, and I'm going to move this hearing along as quickly as possible so that you can get back to following your doctor's orders to rest and elevate your foot.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for that. You're too kind. This is the result of decades of athletic mediocrity and going to a school where the football dorm is named after Arnold Palmer, which ought to tell you something.
Okay, all right. We'll discuss that offline here. I'm going to strictly adhere to the 5-minute rule for each member, and please be cognizant of how much time you have, and if you think you might go over, submit your additional questions for the record. What I hope to get out of this hearing is to lay the groundwork for a long-term vision for the future of the VA. We all know what we need to do over the next year or two to keep VA functioning, but our aspirational goal should be to envision the perfect VA system and strive toward that, knowing that perfection is never attainable, but we need to establish an ideal and move toward that ideal. By now, I'm sure most of you have heard me use the term, the phrase, VA 2030. This is the term I'll use when describing my vision of the VA, hopefully an ideal vision of the VA. My vision is twofold. VA must be a system that is easy to navigate, easy to enter with logical responses as veterans' needs change or new needs arise. The second part of my vision is that VA catches up to the changing and new demographics of veterans and be nimble enough to adapt and respond to those demographic changes. I often use VA's long-term care programs as an example of VA 2030. Today, there are countless resources to receive assistive care, which is great for veterans. Unfortunately, there are countless ways in which veterans veterans can access those services. This makes it confusing for veterans and their loved ones to find the right program to meet their particular needs. In a perfect world, veterans seeking assistance, whether it's with cleaning their house or mowing their lawn or with greater needs for full-time care in a long-term facility, these veterans should have a single point of entry that evaluates their needs and eligibility for services so that veterans and their families can make decisions that are right for them. And as veterans age and their needs change, the care and services provided should adapt to veterans' needs, requiring little effort from the veterans and their families. Using this model, we should be able to remove redundant programs and find gaps in services while making it easier to navigate VA services. In the same vein, we must evaluate VA's programs and services to better serve women veterans, the LGBTQ community, and minority veterans. And with this vision in mind, Ms. Brownlee, the chairwoman of our subcommittee on Veterans Health, Ms. Brownlee developed the idea and framework for the Women Veterans Task Force. This task force will examine the current services that are specific to women veterans to see if there is room for improvement. It will also look at programs and services that are meant to serve all veterans, but might need adjustments to better serve women, like prosthetics and mental health care treatments. This forward-looking process will take trust and a commitment from all involved to work, but we have proven that we have the ability to do it. VA, Congress, and the VSOs all work together to improve the appeals process. 4 years ago, the appeals backlog was enormous and growing. Veterans waited months and years for an answer. Today, thanks to bipartisan cooperation and full involvement with stakeholders, there is a far more efficient process where veterans have the ability to choose which appeal lane works best for them. This model is working to produce more timely decisions that veterans and VSOs are reporting as a large step in the right direction. For the first time in many years, we have a realistic grasp on eliminating the appeals backlog. Mr. Secretary, we have done it before, and we can do it again. And I look forward to hearing from you on the areas in which we can quickly make meaningful changes, and also areas that might take time, like appeals modernization. I also look forward to working with Ranking Member Rowe and the rest of my colleagues on the committee to make sure that we meet the audacious goal of VA 2030. Before well, go ahead. I'm going to yield 5 minutes to my friend Dr. Rowe for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Takano, and welcome to all the new members. I see a lot of new members on the committee, and we've already had a busy start, so welcome to the committee. With the exception of this morning's joint hearing, this is the committee's first hearing of the 116th, and I applaud you, Chairman, for calling this hearing and for ensuring right out of the gate that our work is forward-thinking. The Department of Veterans Affairs is at a critical junction. Access and accountability crisis of 2014 brought VA back to the forefront of our national consciousness and ushered in a season of change that has left no facet of VA untouched. Last Congress saw major pieces of legislation enacted to fundamentally transform how VA provides care to veteran patients, how VA makes decisions about modernizing and realigning medical facilities, how VA processes disability claims appeals, how VA recruits and retains medical professionals and support staff, and for how long VA administers the GI Bill benefits, and how employees found responsible for poor performance or misconduct are held accountable. That's a mouthful what we just did right there, and I want to thank the members, the returning members of the committee, for their work on doing this. That is to say, nothing of significant strides that were made with respect to electronic health record modernization and interoperability with the Department of Defense. This Congress, our focus will need to remain squarely on how these major initiatives are being implemented and how VA is preparing for the revolution they represent. Our work in the last 2 years set the stage for what VA will look like and how VA will function a decade from now. But as the saying goes, and this is one of my favorite philosophers, Yogi Berra, if you don't know where you're going, you might end up someplace else. And it is incumbent on all of us, and especially you, Mr. Secretary, to cast a strong vision on VA's future, to put the right processes and the right people in place to enact that vision, and to remain steady in the face of stumbling blocks and struggles that are inevitable when change of the size and scale we're talking about is concerned. And I want to note that change will come not just from VA, but from the veterans themselves. In the year 2030, the veteran population will look markedly different than it does today. And Mr. Chairman, I'll look markedly older than I do today if I make it that far. There will be fewer veterans overall. There will be more veterans who are women and more veterans who are racial minorities. There will also be more veterans living and working in the South and West by 2030 than we see today. These demographic changes are significant, and VA is going to have to start preparing for them now if the department stands any chance of being prepared for them tomorrow. And that's why I believe so strongly in the need for expedited implementation of the Asset and Infrastructure Review portion of the Mission Act. A rapidly changing veteran population necessitates a rapidly changing VA. The AIR Act specifically structured to assist VA in making those changes and to ensure that those changes are made through an objective, transparent, fully data and consensus-driven process rather than by bureaucrats behind closed doors. I urge you to, in the strongest terms, Mr. Secretary, not to delay the AIR implementation and to work with this committee on any legal impediments to swift implementation of AIR. It is perhaps your greatest tool in preparing the VA for 2030. I want to end with a quick note on information technology before yielding. In the year 2030, if all goes well, the VA will have just finished EHR modernization. It will have a seamless health record exchange with DoD. The EHR's development and operational costs will be predictable because VA will have shifted most of them to Cerner. But 11 years is a lifetime in the software industry, and the EHR is just one element, albeit a big element, of the VA's overall health IT. We need to stay focused on the ultimate goal, interoperability. When the Cerner decision was originally announced, I called on Secretary Shilkin to implement the new EHR inside of a world-class interoperability platform, not to build on interoperability functions inside EHR. I believe that even more strongly today. The partnership with Apple and the Health app is a great example of interoperability solutions that work just as well today with VA Vista as it will in the future with Cerner. I think VA should incorporate an interoperability strategy in any kind of roadmap for the future, and I look forward to hearing this afternoon about how VA intends to do just that. Mr. Chairman Takano, I thank you again for calling this hearing today, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. I ask you, without objection, I'm going to recognize the gentleman from California to speak out of order for 30 seconds to introduce a special guest.
Well, I just wanted to introduce Sidney Walton. He's in the back there. Sidney lives in North County, San Diego. He is a World War II veteran, and today is his 100th birthday.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Sidney. Happy birthday to you.
Yay.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Honored
Thank
to have
you.
you here. Thank you.
Well, Sidney, bless you and all of the members of the greatest generation for what you have done for our country. And but let us get on to the business at hand. I now recognize myself for. Oh, I'm sorry. That's right. I'm getting used to stuff. I now recognize the secretary for his opening statement.
Well, I was going to take a back seat to you, sir. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Dr. Rowe and distinguished members of the committee. This is the 7th month that I have been privileged to be part of this wonderful VA team, and I will take speaker's privilege for less than a minute to introduce myself to this committee, because we have not had an opportunity in this forum to speak with each other. I am very proud that General Mattis described me as having been born in khaki diapers. I take that as a great honor. I am the son of a gravely wounded combat soldier from Vietnam. I have had the honor of serving as an officer in 2 services, the United States Navy and the United States Air Force, and I have been a senior leader in the Department of Defense. I've had no higher honor in my time of public service than to be asked to serve with and for the 20 million veterans of the United States. Earlier in the year, I mentioned that we are no longer on the cusp of transformation. We are in the middle of the most profound transformation in the history of this department since General Omar Bradley was the head of the Veterans Administration right after World War II. I'm also here to say that part of my pride is that I'm a conservative Republican here to praise the federal workforce. In the last few months, the Department of Veterans Affairs has been the recipient of accolades across the country, pointing out to the dedication, the loyalty, and the efficiency of our workforce. For the first time since the Partnership of Public Service began taking its surveys about the best places in the federal government to work, the Department of Veterans Affairs is no longer 16 out of 17 or 17 out of 17. We are in the top third and moving forward. In addition, the Annals of Internal Medicine, Dartmouth, said last year that the medical care afforded to veterans in our system is as good or better than any in the country. And finally, The Journal of the American Medical Association said last year that our wait times are comparable to any in the private sector. That is a testament to the 370,000 American women and men who have made the choice of making the Department of Veterans Affairs their career. So I mentioned that we were in the middle of transformation. Last year, the Congress passed the Mission Act and the President signed it. What the Mission Act does is present our veterans with more choice, more access, more availability. And one thing I will say right at the beginning, I have been told that there are some who believe that the standards we developed were, I believe, arbitrary and capricious. Well, let me say, as someone who came up in this institution, primarily in the other body, that I take Article 1 very seriously. Section 104 of the Mission Act says that in order to develop access and availability standards, we have to use the metrics that we see laid out in TRICARE, in Medicare, and with the 20 largest healthcare insurance systems in the country. And my goal was to provide our veterans with two things: the kind of service that they were used to in the military when it comes to choice and availability, and to put them on the same playing field as their fellow Americans. When it also comes to reform, we are talking about, as Dr. Rose said, the development of an electronic health record. No longer will someone like my father, after 30 years of service and terrible wounds in Vietnam, have to carry around an 800-page paper record. We will begin developing a record that starts the day a young American walks into the military entrance processing station and comes to our VA. In addition to business transformation, we are, as Ms. Brownlee has pointed out in her service on this committee, we are on the cusp of one of the greatest transformations in the history of our armed forces. When my father was commissioned 2 months before the Kennedy administration began, less than 0.5% of those in uniform were women. When I stepped down as the Undersecretary of Defense a few months ago, 17% of the active force were women. My guess is that that will go to 20% by 2025. For the Department of Veterans Affairs, that means that right now, 10% of those we serve are now women. This is not your grandfather's VA anymore. And the symbols that I use to describe the services that we provide is that we serve all of those who have served in uniform. What we will probably also talk about today are the different crises facing VA that are crises facing the rest of the country: opioid abuse, suicide, and homelessness. The great tragedy today is that 20 American veterans take their lives every day. The greater tragedy is that 70% of those veterans are outside of our Department of Veterans Affairs. Thanks to this committee and the Congress, we now have unprecedented resources to devote to that great American scourge, and I thank you for the support there. But suicide, homelessness, and opioids are part of a continuum that can lead to tragedy. And VA is changing the way it treats our veterans. If you had told my father 30 years ago that when he came to the VA, we would be offering same-day mental health services, to alleviate pain, we would not be prescribing opioids in large amounts, but we would be offering an old combat veteran alternative therapies like Tai Chi and yoga, I probably would have gotten in a modest way, a bad look. I might have been hit. But we are changing. We are changing with the climate, and we are on the cusp of creating a modern 21st century healthcare administration. I will conclude my brief remarks by ending the way I end many of my speeches. In my life, I have been taught to look to General Eisenhower for inspiration, and I often remark about a scene on the presidential yacht Williamsburg right after he was inaugurated. He had 40 Korean War veterans on board. Some were missing limbs, the rest were terribly disfigured. And he gave them a charge as only a 5-star general of the Army could do. He said, "You never put your uniform away. You live to remind your fellow Americans why they sleep soundly at night." And I believe that there is no greater charge for the Department of Veterans Affairs than to ensure that we remind our fellow citizens that they sleep soundly at night because of the sacrifices of those who served in uniform. 20 million who live, 9.9 million who use the VA. And I thank you all for everything you do for America's warriors, and I appreciate your courtesy to me. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your open remarks and especially the ending to your remarks. I want to begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes, and I want to begin to ask you some questions about Blue Water Navy. I want to ask you specifically, will the veterans who served in the Republic of Vietnam, including in its territorial sea, be eligible for VA health care now that Procopio is the law of the land?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I won't comment on the merits of the decision because that's a pre-decisional argument that the Justice Department is still going through, but I will say that if the decision stands, we are ready to meet the dictates of that decision. I will also tell you, after discussions with many advocates and those who know much more about this matter than I do, we will probably be coming back to you to discuss how we expand the resources that we have to address the benefits and the resources that we need to go back and look at the population that we will have to help. First of all, we serve about 51,000 Blue Water Navy veterans now who have one of the Agent Orange presumptive, so it's not something that the department has ignored. But if I, as a recovering lawyer, look at past jurisprudence, most recent class action decisions by the Supreme Court will tell us that we will have to not only support, rightfully so, those who served in those waters, but we will have to look to their families and their estates. And right now, I don't know the number of those who would be impacted by that decision, but I stand ready to meet the dictates of the court and come back with a briefing to this committee as to how we will do that.
Thank you for that answer, Mr. Secretary. But have you or do you intend to recommend to the Solicitor General that Procopio be appealed?
The only thing that I have said is what I've told you. I have not given them any detailed response other than to say we will follow the dictates of the court, and if we do have that decision in place, we will have to come back to the Congress. The only other thing I would be truthful in telling you that I think that there are considerations of that decision that impact the State Department and the Department of Defense that I have no insight into in terms of a court actually changing a definition that has been in place since Thomas Jefferson was Secretary of State as to what is the actual definition of a nation state. That's the best I can give you when it comes to my advice. But nobody at the Justice Department has asked me for anything more than that.
So your answer is that you have not recommended an appeal to the Solicitor General?
No, sir.
And you will not be? All right, thank you for that answer. You announced at yesterday at the Milcom VA Subcommittee hearing that you plan to prioritize the initial claims of veterans awarded the Purple Heart. I just want to endorse this decision and congratulate you for that. Can you tell us how you will implement this plan? And for example, will you use the DD 214 to make these determinations?
Absolutely, sir. Yes, we will use the DD 214 now. There are some Purple Heart recipients who are still the victims of that terrible fire in St. Louis in 1974 that wiped out 30, 40, 50, 60 years of Army records. We will do everything we can with the support of the VSOs and DOD when those come to us with those claims and say they have a Purple Heart to go back and make sure they are made whole.
How quickly do you expect to get moving on this, about the timing? Will implementation start immediately?
I believe we're going to do that in the next few months. I will contact the Department of Defense and make sure that those who are leaving active service with the Purple Heart are aware of the new regulations, and they put that in their transition package when they depart service. So the new batch of soldiers who have the Purple Heart know that when it comes to claims for their future in VA, they will have access to the front of the line.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I'm going to yield back to the rest of my time and recognize Dr. Rowe for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and we'd like to also welcome Mr. Sablon back to the committee. He's like a bad headache. He just keeps going away and coming back, so welcome back again. Mr. Secretary, very quickly, as I mentioned in the opening statement, I believe the Asset and Infrastructure Review component of the Mission Act is critical to ensuring that the VA is set up to succeed in 2030 and beyond. What's the status of the market assessments and that represent the initial data gathering stage of the AIR Act?
Yes, sir. Thank you. And this is also in line with the chairman's article back in November with military.com about the movement of the demographics within the VA. The market assessments were held up after the passage of mission in the courts. That is now clear. We have let those contracts. I expect the first phase of the market assessments to be completed in the next few months. I also expect all of the market assessments to be completed in 2020. The Asset Infrastructure Review Commission under statute is not scheduled to convene until 2022. If we finish in 2020, that is a 2-year lag. I think to meet the expectations of this committee and the changing world of veterans, we're going to have to come back to the Congress and ask that we move that timeline up so that the information available to the Asset Infrastructure Review Commission is fresh. And they won't have to ask to go back in time to fill in the gaps that may have emerged from the time that the market assessments finished and the time they convene.
So is there anything, any support you need from the committee to begin implementing the AIR Act? That's the other question, I guess, if you think we should move it up because of that length of time, 2 years.
Yes, sir. I will say that I will come back to you in the summer after this phase is completed and give you an assessment as to where I think things are. And then if we're on schedule for 2020, then I will ask for that authority.
Well, the reason I think this is so critical is that this is in the private sector too. This is not just the VA, but heads in hospital beds peaked in 1981. So we had more patients actually by count in 1981 than we do today, and yet the population's grown 40%. The VA is not immune to that, and the VA and the demographics of the country are shifting where, as we said before, veterans are moving south and west. Example, in California, 10% of the homeless veterans live in one county, in LA County, and it's a huge problem, so we see that. And the VA needs to be more nimble, I think, in how it's able to move, and I think this asset review is absolutely, we can't keep 1,000 buildings underutilized or not utilized at all and adequately fund the things we're talking about, the chairman was talking about, Blue Water Navy and so on. Would you concur with that?
Yes, sir, absolutely. This is part of an entire business transformation effort that not only includes the assets of the department, but the modernization of our business systems, our HR systems, the electronic health record, our supply chain, which I would look forward to coming to the committee with a focus on that as we discuss how we move forward to the 2030 date. It's part of an overall revamping of the department that is long overdue.
Are your VA medical centers, are the directors or the visiting directors, are they looking at their plot of real estate right now and saying, how do we want to look in Vision 1 or 10 in, as the chairman says, in 10 years or 12 years?
Congressman, that's exactly what they're doing. They're looking at not only the demand signal from our veterans in a region, but also the age of the infrastructure. As we sit here today, about 63% of our beds are filled. That is not an efficient running system at 63%. We must reevaluate the number of beds that we're operating. In addition, as you are well aware, it is very difficult to assess the quality of the commercial systems around us. They are not as transparent as your VA is. Therefore, being able to cull the information in the first 59 facilities that we'll be in the next 3 months in order to do this evaluation is essential.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Lamb, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I think you've gotten a lot of questions in recent days about the vacancies in the VA workforce. Understand that's growing. We're now, I think we're getting close to 49,000 at this point, almost 43,000 in VHA. Is that your assessment as well?
Yes, sir. Of our authorized end strength, yes.
Right. So we're showing up every day with less than 10% or with more than 10% missing of who we could have. Let me just ask you, I know there are a lot of reasons for that. I know the industry across the board is having some problems recruiting people. Are you concerned about the shortage, and what are you doing internally to try to fill these positions?
I will be honest with you. Yes, I am concerned. I would not be honest with you if I told you that my focus would be filling 47,000 vacancies. I have to prioritize our efforts as to where we have the most need. Your service in the Marine Corps will tell you exactly what I'm about to say. My first week as the secretary, I had 2 senior officials come to me and had 2 different numbers as to the number of employees we had. And the second one, I said, where's your Manning document? What's a Manning document? As you know from your service, that's a list of the requirements you have plus the people to meet them. We have none. For the first time, we now have a full-up executive system in place for HR management. So the focus of my efforts is to fill primary care, women's health, and mental health. We have to compete with the rest of the country. Those are the greatest areas. Mental health goes without saying. Women's health, that's because, as I mentioned at the outset, the makeup of our veterans population has changed dramatically. And primary health, because our newer veterans are used to urgent care. So we are taking the tools that this committee has provided, relocation, bonus pay, increased salary. I'm going to probably come back to you and ask to expand that so we can reach deeper into those populations. And Dr. Stone does this on a daily basis.
Sure. Just before you cut in, Dr. Stone, and I'll give you the rest of my time to address it, I would like to leave here with a sense of what it is that has helped us so far in the recruitment efforts. So it sounds like you're saying bonus pay, increased salary, relocation assistance.
Absolutely.
You had some success last year in mental health in particular, right? Yes. Attracting mental health professionals.
I have not cleared this statement with anyone above my pay grade, the White House. I've had this conversation with General Mattis when he was secretary. You all have helped us begin to break out of the traditional OPM industrial age model of compensation. And that is absolutely vital if we're going to continue to serve veterans on all these levels that I just pointed out.
And just one more question before we get to Dr. Stone. Have you received any direction at all from the administration not to fill these vacancies or not to fill some percentage of them? This is for the secretary.
Oh, no, sir, not at all, no.
Thank you. Go ahead, Dr. Stone.
As you know, American healthcare, and as you've referenced, Congressman, American healthcare is a tremendously turbulent labor market. We are growing at 2 to 3% a year. We are faced with managing the system without the kind of Manning document that we need. We have fielded a commercial off-the-shelf HR system that is beginning to give us at least the discipline that we can see the openings of authorized end strength. But that doesn't reflect how we're meeting the needs of veterans. And the best way to look at this is not against the 49,000, but against what our wait times are. and our wait times continue to be reduced across the delivery system. And I would encourage you to take a look at those as far as how we're responding to urgent need. Every one of our medical centers today has same-day access to mental health care and has same-day access to primary care.
And not to cut you off, but I do agree with that. The wait times are improving, and I'm proud of that, and I thank you both for working hard on that. I also know that we're being told by the workforce, the boots on the ground, the nurses, the staff members, that they are shorthanded, and it's affecting the quality of their work, and it's affecting their own health and physical condition at the end of the workday. So the shortages are being felt by the people who are there, and I think we all need to work together to address them.
And I'll just emphasize, and I agree with you, we do compete in that same pool as the private sector and as the military does. I will also add to what Dr. Stone said about wait times. One of the prides I have in coming to you is that in the latest survey of our veterans who are in our system, there's an 89% satisfaction rate, which tells you that we are getting that quality service. But as you pointed out, if we don't get the nurses and the doctors the help, that's going to go down.
All right, the gentleman's time has expired. Let's try to keep our questions within the time frame. We have been called for votes. We have time for one more question before we're going to be having to go vote. I want to recognize, it's a Republican though, Mr. Belarakis, the gentleman from Florida, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate your service, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Secretary, looking back at the past 10 years, despite an increase in funding, VA's data shows that veteran suicide rates have not declined, or they haven't significantly declined, that's for sure, but rather at best remain steady. With around 20 veterans dying by suicide every day, to me, VA has failed those veterans. And I understand, and you can elaborate, Mr. Secretary, about the 70%, what have you, but the fact is that these are veterans, and we need to get to these veterans and get them the care they deserve. My question is, in 2030, how will VA have worked to eliminate the veteran suicide? So instead of 20 veterans dying every day, we are down to less than 1. And can you elaborate how you expect the broad public health approach VA is taking will achieve better outcomes?
Yes, sir. I'll let Dr. Stone talk about the broad, new public health approach that we have to our individual veterans. I will say, as I said earlier, it is a great national tragedy. Of those 20 veterans who take their own lives every day, 2 or 3 are on active duty. 2 or 3 are from the Guard and Reserve. The vast majority, I understand from our surveys, are from the Vietnam era. So some of those American warriors have problems that began when Lyndon Johnson was president. I can't cure that, but I can put resources and new thinking into our suicide prevention program. This year, our budget for suicide prevention is over $200 million. We have on board now the Pentagon's senior expert on suicide as a permanent leader of our suicide prevention efforts. We've even provided your office staff's insight on what you can do if a veteran calls you in distress. We're spreading that out across the country. We now have same-day mental health services. That is absolutely vital for those veterans who are calling out for our help. We had about 20,000 individual events last year in terms of education and outreach. The last 2 months of the fiscal year, when I became secretary, I understand there was a GAO report that said $15 million had not been spent on outreach. In the 2 months that I was in charge, I spent 13 out of that $15 million on outreach. We will not let a penny go unspent in that area. But we are now engaged in a holistic approach and a cry for help also to the greater public really quick. I spent a lot of time in the Pacific and the Pacific Northwest talking to our native peoples. I went to Alaska, talked to the Alaska Federation of Natives. More than half of the veterans in Alaska are outside of VA. I asked them to double the number of tribal representatives that they have to help us find those veterans. That same formula applies in Florida, which is the fastest growing veterans state in the country. I need veterans, I need mayors, I need NGOs, I need churches, because we aren't reaching those 14 out of 20. And I'll let Dr. Stone tell you about the medical approaches that we're taking.
The great difficulty that we face is, in spite of the fact that we can identify risk subpopulations within the veteran community, it's reaching them. The 14 deaths a day that occur in veterans not associated with us, not coming to us for care, require a public health approach and a partnership with multiple communities as well as nonprofits to support us. Let me give you an example of that. Never activated Guard and Reserve are not considered veterans. They've never been called to federal service. 3 a day of the 14, 3 a day commit suicide, primarily within former Army Reserve, which account for 2 of those 3. 1 of 3 come from the Guard. In addition, when veterans transition out of service, many of them don't engage us. And an active engagement using our transition assistant programs to try and get them to engage with us should be very helpful in engaging back. So success in 2030, a public health approach that brings us back into contact with the 14 a day at risk and mitigating that risk.
The gentleman's time has expired. I'm going to call a recess so that members can go vote, but I encourage all members to return as soon as possible after the final votes so that we can resume questioning with the Secretary.
That's what's on.
Audio check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
committee will reconvene. And Secretary, by unanimous consent, I want to accord you 2 minutes for a point of personal privilege.
Thank you, sir. I won't take that long. I was remiss when I came in, and I saw the picture of Walter Jones, a senior, on the wall. Mr. Jones was a friend of my wife's family in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and I was a close friend of his son and your colleague, late colleague Walter Jones Jr. And I issued a statement on behalf of the Department of Veterans Affairs when Congressman Jones passed, that the veterans of Eastern North Carolina didn't have a better friend. And I miss him, I miss his friendship, and I thank you for allowing me to mention him. And I appreciate your courtesy.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I also had a chance to get to know Mr. Jones, and he will be missed in the Congress. I now want to recognize for 5 minutes the gentleman from New Hampshire, Mr. Pappas.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate your patience, Secretary Wilkie. Sure. And, I think as has been said for the last several days as we've convened, we're at an important inflection point for the VA. I see that in terms of my own state and a leadership transition that's happened at the Manchester VA in New Hampshire, as well as what's happening across the country. So thanks for your efforts as part of that, and really look forward to the working relationship over the next couple of years. We talked a little bit before about workforce and about some of the challenges that the system faces at recruiting and retaining, and certainly that's a problem across our economy that any medical facility is grappling with right now. I want to ask specifically about physician assistants. And I know there's been legislation recently on this. The VA Choice and Quality Employment Act of 2017 required the implementation of competitive pay for physician assistants to improve recruitment and retention. The Omnibus Appropriation Bill of 2018 also had a provision requiring a pilot program to train military corpsmen and medics to become PAs, and upon graduation, work within the VA. I'm wondering if you can give us an update on the implementation of this program.
Let me say a couple of things. Mid-level providers, whether they be nurse practitioners, CRNAs, or physician's assistants, are essential to our delivery system. And therefore, expansion of the utilization and the assurance that we can use them to the maximum level of their license is essential to the future. As we implement the additional training of training corpsmen, or those coming out with advanced skill sets from the services to additional PA or additional PA skill sets and licensure was included in the laws, as you mentioned, and we are actively working to implement those and to move the funds against those to provide scholarship abilities for it. And so we look forward to expanding the role of PAs in our delivery system. And as we have talked already, the difficulties in rural areas, PAs can fulfill that, as can our advanced practice nurses.
Thank you. I appreciate your response on that, and look forward to continuing to provide some oversight on this committee in terms of the rollout. In addition to that, I wanted to ask a little bit about the burn pit issue. It's been one that's received the focus of this committee. It's going to continue to receive the focus over the next term. And I'm wondering what changes you'd like to see in the VA's burn pit registry to make sure that it's an effective tool to provide compensation and care for veterans who have been exposed.
Yes, sir. I mentioned at the beginning I'm a son of a combat soldier from Vietnam, and I'm acutely aware on a personal level of the toll that combat brings, issues like Agent Orange. I actually have the perspective when I came back to the public sector of having worked with Senator Tillis and Senator Klobuchar to draft the burn pit legislation that eventually became law. The burn pit registry being vital to that, because we don't want to see what happened with Agent Orange happen again. I am confident that we are getting the number of warriors who are exposed to those burn pits in the numbers that are sufficient so that when a determination is made as to how to deal with that on a health care level, that we will be ready to launch in a way that we weren't ready to launch on Agent Orange back in the 80s and early 90s.
The only thing I'd add to the Secretary's statement is that the exposure to burn pits seems to cause some sort of very small airway disease, and it is very difficult to diagnose. And although we have large numbers of veterans who have registered as burn pit exposed, we have lesser numbers that have come in and actually gone through healthcare examinations for us. And we need to do a better job of reaching out to them, to bring them into the system, to assure that we are capturing everything we possibly can. I happen to have had the opportunity early in my training of working Agent Orange clinics. I understand the difficulty that we had at that time. We need to not repeat that fact with burn pit exposure. This all must, however, be based on science, and therefore we need access to the veteran to do so.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. I now would like to recognize the gentleman from Florida, Dr. Dunn, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Takano, and thank you, Secretary Wilkie, for taking the time to be here with us today. I appreciate that. Thank you for your participation. I want to applaud you on the list of priorities that you've laid out for the clear mission. It makes it easier for our committee to help you with the tools to accomplish the overall mission that you have of serving our veterans. I also commend your efforts for consulting a number of resources in order to establish best practices, resources from the government, from the private sector organizations, to create the best proposed standards pertaining to wait times and driving times to the VA facilities. With the specialty care access standards to be finalized soon, can this committee anticipate that the proposed rules for transplant care will reflect the proposed rule for access in specialty care, or am I mistaken and the transplant care is built into the specialty rules?
It will come separately and within the next few weeks. We originally wrote into the access standards the transplant standards, and it became very confusing. We decided to pull back in order to get the access standards out and to begin the debate on access standards, but you'll see them within the next few weeks. And it's absolutely essential for us to get those standards out for transplant. There are many areas of the country where we're the only provider, in especially remote areas. We need to get those standards out and allow the debate to occur on them.
If you would like us to weigh in, I have done transplant surgery. I'm sure we can find the standards pretty easily and work our way through that with you. So I look forward to working with you on that. The Mission Act contained actually two provisions relating to transplant care, and the other one was Section 153 that provided the department with authority to provide living donor transplants. That's something new to the VA. Of course, the department will not be able to utilize that authority until the rulemaking process is complete, and I understand that to be projected to be sometime around July 2020. We already have veterans that are suffering on the waiting list, and it seems like we can do a little faster than that with living, and again, with the living donors, there's plenty of guidelines on that in all the transplant centers all over the country. Can we move that forward, or can there be an interim rule?
Congressman, the council would have to judge whether we can do it by interim rule or not. And so I'm respectful of that, and I have not asked for an interim rule. But you are correct, and we support your position of trying to move this faster. And as we roll out all of these regulations regarding Mission Act, this is one that has to come quickly forward. You know, we do over $8 billion worth of end-stage renal disease care inside the VA. The ability to do transplants are essential to transforming the lives of those veterans in end-stage disease.
And many of the transplant centers that the VA has are actually co-located with civilian, great famous transplant centers that are civilian, and as are other VA hospitals that do not do transplants. And I assure you that, I have many friends who are still doing that in that arena who would love to help you and love to help our veterans. With that, I want to thank you both for coming here and sharing your ideas. Secretary Wilkie.
I agree with Dr. Stone that we need to push this as quickly as possible, but I wanted to thank you too, because the very first event that I did as the secretary was with you in North Florida.
That's
and I
right. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your courtesy to me. It was very much appreciated as the new and unknown guy on the block.
Thank you so much, sir. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman,
You've had a
changed.
substitution.
I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes Mr. Levin of California for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing today. Thank you, Secretary Wilkie, for joining us. I'm hoping that committee members have a strong and productive relationship with you this Congress so that we can achieve as much possible success for our veterans as we can. And I'm very honored to be the new chair of the Subcommittee on Economic Opportunity for Veterans and represent the district in Southern California with Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton. I do want to ask you about some concerns that I've heard surrounding the implementation of the Forever GI Bill and the VBA's IT systems as a whole. Both of those issues, I think, will be a focus this Congress. Mr. Secretary, in your written testimony, you discussed the implementation of Sections 107 and 501 of the Forever GI Bill, and you said, and I quote, "By spring 2020, all enrollments will be processed according to the Comrie Act," end quote. And as I understand it, you'll have 3 or 4 semesters worth of claims to reprocess while also processing the spring 2020 claims. We certainly don't want a repeat of what happened last fall, where delays and late payments impacted our student veterans. I haven't seen a detailed plan on how you're going to accomplish this goal, so I ask, what is the VA's plan to make it happen? Are you going to need more staff, bandwidth upgrades, or IT fixes, and are those needs going to be included in the President's budget?
Thanks, sir. And I'll get you the schematic on the way ahead, but let me describe what happened. My first full day in office was August 1st of last year, and it was pretty apparent to me that we were reinforcing a broken system. And I ordered that we go back to the previous system, which pays our recipients, but we were paying them at the FY18 level. My goal was to make sure that our veterans had something in their pockets. Now, in terms of the overall difference, we're talking about a cost of living increase that was less than 1%. But I made the command decision to go back so they had money in their pockets. Those who might have been overpaid because of bad IT, we're not going to make them pay that back. And those who were not given the entire amount of money they were entitled to, they will be made whole. The contract for the new system was let out last week. What I put in my formal testimony is accurate. I expect everything to be on schedule and back to the norms set by the GI Bill either at the end of this year or at the beginning of next year. I don't envision any new staff having to be hired because the IT system, which is being run by a very important big company, I believe will obviate the need for additional staff, but I will be back to you if there is any change in that.
Appreciate that, Mr. Secretary. Different topic. Homelessness among veterans is an issue that's very important to me and will always be at the forefront of our constituents. It's a big issue in Southern California. Our district encompasses San Diego County, and in North San Diego County there are several hundred homeless veterans. We as a nation have made a lot of progress on this issue in the past decade, but we still have a long ways to go. Obviously, if one veteran is homeless, that's one too many. How does VA plan to work with its partner agencies to address veteran homelessness once the veteran is already in crisis? And also, how are we going to identify more veterans at risk for homelessness before they're in crisis, push resources to them early, and identify risk factors during the transition to tailor the transition assistance program to the needs of the individual?
Thank you, sir. If the chair will indulge me, I'm going to probably take more than 45 seconds. And let me start with, I think, was the saddest observation that I've made in my short time as VA Secretary, and it pertains to Southern California. I was in West Los Angeles at their VA center, and about 6 or 7 o'clock at night, cars started to come into the facility, and the people in the cars were not coming out to go to the hospital. I was informed that these were veterans who had jobs, who were contributing to the tax base of Los Angeles County, who were employed, fully employed, but they could not afford a place to live. I went to the mayor of Los Angeles, Mayor Garcetti, and said, we need to be closer. We do have programs that this committee and your companion committee dealing with HUD have now fully funded. However, I think we need more VASH vouchers. But I began discussions with the city and county of Los Angeles to allow them to create more transitional housing for us. The problems, as you said, are particularly acute on the West Coast. It was an eye-opener. One way we're looking at this in terms of long-term, and I talked at the beginning of the hearing about a continuum of issues, opioids, homelessness, suicide, and how they come together. We've changed our approach to medical care for those who are at highest risk by taking a whole health approach and working with our cities and counties to find people who are outside of our purview and bring them into the system. We've changed the way that we prescribe medicine. We are now looking at more creative ways to partner with the states to create that transitional housing. Dr. Stone could talk more about the medical side, but we have to look at this in a new way. When veterans are working and they are making the community better because they're working, we need to expand the aperture on housing. It is Southern California that is the epicenter. I intend to go back again, but I applaud. I have not talked to Governor Newsom. I had a long discussion with Governor Brown before he left, and the mayor. I'm going to talk to the mayor of San Diego as well. If we got a handle on homelessness in Southern California, the number of homeless veterans in this country would decrease exponentially. That's the epicenter. We will do more.
Thank you.
The only thing I'd add to that is a number of our medical centers, probably Washington, D.C. as the prototype for it, does recurrent outreaches to the community in which we bring in as many veterans as possible at risk and create a one day in which we do everything we can to try and get them off the street and into our healthcare systems. A month ago, we conducted that at the Washington, D.C. VA. Many of us were there for the day working those issues and brought in more than 1,000 veterans from this community, either at risk of homelessness or homeless, in order to bring them an opportunity to improve their lives.
And I would note that it's not as if America as a whole is not getting a handle on this. About 10 years ago, 400,000 veterans and their families were on the street. It's still too many. It's down to 70. But what I've noticed in my time, both as the Undersecretary of Defense and now as the VA Secretary, is that we're now seeing different populations. Young mothers with families on the street. And that's why I felt it was so important to get to the leaders in Southern California to get us started. That's not a satisfactory answer, but it is certainly an issue that we need new approaches to. Apologize for going long.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. The chair recognizes Mr. Barr from Kentucky for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Rowe. Thank you for holding this hearing. Secretary Wilkie, Dr. Stone, thank you all very much for your service at the department, your service in the military, and continued service to our veterans. It's probably my highest honor to represent the veterans of the 6th Congressional District in this seat, and it's a big responsibility as well. And we established a Veterans Coalition that's now over 1,000 veterans in the 6th Congressional District of Kentucky, and they do a great job giving our office information and feedback about how we can best serve them. And Secretary, you mentioned in your testimony that the VA is now engaged in the greatest transformative period of its history, and I think that's in part largely because of the work that this Congress did in the last Congress passing the VA Mission Act. And in this Congress, we will have the responsibility, the important responsibility of overseeing your department in the implementation of the Mission Act. Mr. Secretary, in your testimony, you mentioned the transition from the various programs established under VA Choice to the new streamlined Veteran Community Care Program. Can you describe how the new Veteran Community Care Program is going to be better for the veterans in the 6th District of Kentucky and around the country? We know that in January you issued the proposed access standards, so I think our veterans understand what those are. But beyond that, beyond those proposed access standards, what can our veterans expect in terms of the transition from choice to the new community care?
The first step in creating a modern 21st century healthcare administration, when it comes to community care, there were 7 different community care programs. This Congress, the last Congress, culled that down to 1, so it's understandable to veterans, to providers, to the local communities. We now have in place the contracts for 4 regions in the country who will be able, the companies that we have the contracts for, will be able to pay our local hospitals, our small town doctors, what they are owed. Legacy payments will be first. We cannot offer choice, greater choice, unless our small towns are taken care of. Without that, then the system collapses in on itself. I am particularly cognizant of rural America, not just the Great West, where we're talking about expanse of hundreds and hundreds of miles, but also places that I'm familiar with, having grown up in North Carolina, rural Tennessee, rural Kentucky, rural North Carolina, allowing our veterans, when they need it, to go to our small town hospitals. So consolidating the programs into one, easily understandable, paying our bills, and training our local doctors, nurses, clinics to be part of our greater system. Without that, choice does not work. The second part of this, and it is the part that is not seen, is the greater business transformation of the department. HR, supply chain. I've talked about General Mattis. General Mattis and I decided that because we kept reading stories about VA doctors not having the right equipment, and some doctors had nurses having to run across a parking lot to another hospital to get that equipment, we decided that the best thing for us would be to join up with the Defense Logistics Agency and operate a modern supply chain, computerized, programmed supply chain, so that we distribute what we need to our doctors and nurses and medical professionals across the country when the need is there. Without that, we can do all the reforms we want, but if the doctors and the clinics and the hospitals don't have the supplies, it doesn't matter. Dr. Stone has anything?
And Mr. Secretary, if I could just interject one kind of snippet of feedback that we're getting from our veterans is the frustration that they had with choice was the additional layer of bureaucracy going through the contractor and then the the medical records getting lost from VA to the contractor and then finally getting to a community care provider. In my remaining time, Mr. Chairman, with your indulgence, one final question, and that is, as you know, veterans diagnosed with post-traumatic stress and traumatic brain injury often become isolated and withdrawn as they try to manage their trauma experience. Studies have shown that programs such as adaptive sports help recovering veterans with engagement, independence, and quality of life, which are also important factors in preventing veteran suicide. As you may know, I represent the horse capital of the world, and am particularly aware of the benefits that equine-assisted therapy can have in adaptive sports. And my question is, in what ways is your department looking to expand adaptive sports therapies, and in particular equine-assisted therapy?
So we currently have 60 active equine programs across the system. Very effective, as you stated, and just in recognition of the time, we are actively looking to expand it as we are all other adaptive sports.
Thanks. I look forward to working with you. Yield back.
Gentleman's time expired. I'd like to recognize the gentlelady from Virginia, Ms. Luria.
Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary, for meeting with us today, and I want to thank you again for the outreach from your office. I know that the new veterans in Congress appreciated the opportunity to meet with you and your staff.
And I think you got a visit from my daughter today with the Virginia Space Coast Scholars, talking to you about that program in your district.
Yeah, well, thank you as well. And also, thank you as well for the attention to the growing population of women veterans, and I appreciate you having Dr. Patricia Hayes from the Veterans Health Administration reach out to us as well to address some of those issues in more depth. And through our conversations that we had, we talked specifically about the ways that we can leverage the partnership between the VA and DoD facilities. Furthermore, after that, I met with DoD health leadership within my district, and I do think that within Hampton Roads, there are additional possibilities to leverage that, and I know that it's been successful in other places in the country. So I wanted to thank you for suggesting that, and look forward to working with you and your staff on that as well. As the chair of the Disability Assistance and Memorial Affairs Subcommittee, wanted to get back to the previous discussion about the Blue Water veterans from earlier in this hearing, and just wanted to make an additional clarification. I appreciate your assurance that if Procopio stands, that you'll follow the dictates of the court, but I wanted to further clarify. My understanding is that decision only includes Blue Water veterans for the purposes of VA benefits, but for the purposes of VA health care, would you, as within your discretion as Secretary, extend Priority 6 health care for the Blue Water veterans?
I'm going to give you an incomplete answer. I would assume that would be the case. I don't know legally if I just don't know.
We're making that assumption, but have not had legal clarification of it. But we are actually working our way through trying to understand the scope of services. As the Secretary mentioned in his prior testimony, we are already treating a portion of that beneficiary population. Should the rest come, we are preparing for that.
Okay, so from your answer, the assumption is we're all moving forward under the assumption that they will receive the health care benefits as well.
I will ask the lawyers and get you a complete answer.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you. And I yield the remainder of my time. Thank you.
Gentlewoman yields back. I'd now like to recognize the gentlewoman from American Samoa, Ms. Radawagan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Takano and Ranking Member Dr. Rowe. Welcome, Secretary Wilkie. It's great to see you again. When it comes to the future of VA, I'm really optimistic. Work is never done, but we've made some great strides forward last year under the leadership of former Chairman Rowe. With continuation of that leadership under Chairman Takano, I'm sure we can carry forth with that momentum, and I'm looking forward to working with VA on the implementation of the VA Mission Act and other bills passed last Congress. And I also look forward to working with my colleagues on unfinished business such as Blue Water Navy. Mr. Secretary, thank you for your continued commitment to serving our veterans in the territories, especially when it comes to accessibility to health care. I don't have a specific question at this time, per se. Instead, I just want to reaffirm that commitment and give you some time to briefly touch on VA's plans regarding community care options and the insular areas.
Thank you, and I will come see you. I have a particular interest in your area of America, but as part of a larger issue, and that is the people of the Pacific Islands, the people of the nations of the United States, the mainland, participate in the armed forces at a rate higher than any other groups in America. Highest percentage per capita of Medal of Honor holders. And that is a community that I would like to pay special attention to because of the contributions, but because also of the unique challenges that exist in your area, access, distance, also in the continental United States, distance as well in places like Alaska. The statistic I use is that in a place like Alaska, half of the veterans are outside of the VA. I think the numbers in Samoa and Marianas and Guam are not as high, but they're in the high numbers. And that is something that we have to redress, and I thank you for your courtesy to me.
The gentlewoman yields back. I now would like to recognize the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Rice.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for being here and for being patient while we had to go and vote. I want to commend you on all of your efforts that you're making to modernize the VA. And there's one area of modernization that I have been working with Senator Gillibrand on and a lot of the service organizations, and that is to, through the motto of the VA, recognize the contribution of women veterans. The department up to this point has rejected the idea of modernizing the VA motto to be more inclusive of all veterans by stating that, quote, it is not VA's policy. The original motto comes from a line from Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address. And we propose to change it very simply to read as follows: to fulfill President Lincoln's promise to care for those who shall have borne the battle and for their families, caregivers, and survivors. Now, this is not an issue of political correctness, but more an issue of respect for the over 2 million women veterans in the United States today. And I just wonder if you could give your opinion about what you think. Would you be, until we are able to pass the bill that we are going to reintroduce in this Congress, would you be willing to institute a change to the motto for everyone who works within the VA so that we can recognize the significant contributions of all of our women veterans?
Yes, ma'am. Let me tell you my philosophy first, and then I will address the motto. I mentioned earlier today when referencing Representative Brownlee that my motto is that we serve all veterans. In my prior life as the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness, my first directive was to finally give the Department of Defense a policy on sexual harassment and equal opportunity, and to revive and modernize our equal opportunity apparatus. That also includes the LGBT community. That is why I am very happy to say that we serve all veterans. I think you will find that veterans hospitals are a welcoming place, that we are adjusting and have adjusted to the change in the demographics. I'm very proud of that. It doesn't matter who you are, where you're from, you put on the uniform, you're a veteran. I will tell you philosophically, I am not arrogant enough to say that I want to change Abraham Lincoln's words.
Well,
I think, let me finish, if you mind, if you don't mind. Abraham Lincoln, the greatest figures in Western civilization. Without him, there is no Veterans Bureau, Veterans Department. I am happy with being part of his legacy, but I tell you what our philosophy is. We serve all veterans, and I am not in favor of changing the motto. I let actions speak louder than words, and
I appreciate that, and let me
that's
just...
my hardcore feeling.
No, I appreciate that, but let me also say that there would, in keeping with President Lincoln's focus on equality for all, I am sure if he were alive today, he would say women should be acknowledged as well, just because they didn't serve back then. But I appreciate your position, and I hope someday maybe you will change your opinion on that. Very quickly, because I'm mindful of the time, earlier before the break, you had mentioned efforts that you were making to face the challenge of recruitment, retention of the workforce. I just want to speak about the Northport VA, which is just outside of my district, but on Long Island. In the past 2 years alone, they have had changeover. They've had 4 medical center directors, 3 chiefs of staff, 3 nursing department directors, and the heads of the human resources department and physical plant have all left the facility. So that's just an example in one VA just outside of my district. So we have to come up with and I appreciate the efforts that you were making, but we really have to step it up, because that's just at one VA, that kind of turnover. You can't have any consistency in care with turnover like that.
I'll let Dr. Stone finish that. I want to apologize. I did not mean to cut you off on the previous exchange. And
Oh, no, I just
I
was...
appreciate your
It was just the
passion
time. Thank you.
And I thank you for letting me speak.
The authorities under which we retain our medical center directors limit our pay to about 35% of what a medical center director could earn, even in a medium-sized city.
Yeah.
You should expect from us some proposals that would begin to look at medical center director pay in order for us to retain these great talents. On average, a medical center director earns between $150,000 and $180,000. That number is between $350,000 and $600,000 in the commercial space. Now, that said, 87% of our medical center director positions are filled. Why? Because people are connected to the mission. And it goes back to your previous comments. People love this mission. It's why we retain nurses at dramatic rates. People are connected to the mission.
Thank you. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentlelady's time has expired. I'd now like to recognize the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Banks, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to challenge you for a moment. I appreciate that you held this hearing today on the future of the VA at 2030, and the data has already been shared many times today, but as you know, we currently have 19.5 million veterans today. And 2030, the date that we've chosen for the hearing today, a vision for the future of the VA at 2030, will have a projected 15.5 million veterans. But let's look beyond that for a moment. And hopefully sometime in the future we can have a hearing on the VA at 2045, because that's the date that I circle. And look, at that point, we'll have what is forecasted about 12 million veterans. And at that point, it'll be the Gulf War generation, the post 9/11 generation, my generation of veterans, from 19.5 million veterans today to a projected 12 million veterans at 2045. The VA has no choice but to modernize and become much more different in how it serves our veterans from what it does today. I look forward to that hearing at some point as well, but I do applaud you in this hearing today, because looking to the future is an important part of what we do on this committee. So with that, Secretary Wilkie, there's an incredible amount of talk about sinister plots to privatize the VA, with really no evidence that that's happening. The real issue that I see is the integration of the military health system. Some amount of integration has to become inevitable when it comes to military health system. VA is going to need the military population, and DoD already needs the veteran patient mix. MHS Genesis and electronic health record modernization are going to make integration increasingly possible, as I know you agree. So what are your goals here when it comes to that? What kind of planning is your team doing to make sure that that integration is orderly, beneficial, rather than haphazard?
You've said it, change management is the key. The answer that I give to a lot of people, the issue of privatization, is in line with your remarks. Without the electronic health record actually keeps VA at the center of a veteran's life. We are in the process, and I will be coming to this committee hopefully to discuss the final building block in terms of joint program management of this, of the EHRM, which will bring together formally the Department of Defense and VA in a way that no two large departments have ever come together. So that is the joint solution in the future. The other part of this is the demographic change, which you just highlighted and which the chairman highlighted in his article from military.com. I'm in the process of standardizing and MOUs for our relationship with our military partners. For instance, Fort Sill, Oklahoma, classic example. VA happened to have more dentists than Fort Sill did. We entered into an arrangement where Fort Sill shared our dentists with Fort Sill. Fort Sill opened up Reynolds Army Hospital to the VA. The problem with that paradigm is that it really depends upon the personalities of the leaders involved, the personality of the MedCom commander. We have to eliminate that. My hometown is Fayetteville, North Carolina. We sit underneath Womack Army Medical Center. The cross-pollination of our resources is absolutely essential if we are going to mitigate extra costs, cut down on administrative overhead, and create that modern system. I expect that whomever replaces General Mattis on a permanent basis, I will be in constant discussion with them. And you are right, it is actually 2045 that we really need to have our eyes on, because without that increased cooperation between VA and DoD, many of these reforms won't work.
I appreciate your perspective. Certainly, America needs a robust medical care system to deploy with our warfighters. And it is deeply troubling when you listen to the potential disassembling of that system, including potential of 17,000 medics coming out of uniform. That said, the Secretary's vision of an interoperable EHR, a combined supply chain, facilitates reduction in risk should you see in the future the need to bring these systems closer together. In addition, our polytrauma systems are robust and growing. This is a healthy and growing healthcare system that we anticipate, even with the reduction in veterans, continuing increased dependence of the remaining veterans on the system. The complexity of a lifelong commitment to our veterans, as I stated earlier in our end-stage renal disease, are exactly the kind of patients that active duty military need to sustain their skill sets. So we have 1,700 academic affiliations today. We look forward to a close and productive relationship with our DoD partners in the future.
Mr. Chairman, my time has expired.
The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Cisneros.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Secretary Wilkie and Dr. Stone, for being here and for your testimony today. Secretary Wilkie, ensuring service members receive the most adequate care and knowledge possible when transitioning from active service to civilian life is of the utmost importance to me. I am most concerned about our transitioning service members falling through our institutional gaps, not aware of the benefits they deserve, and not uplifted in the way we promised. I think it's great the work that you're doing on the transition to the health service, electronic health service records, and the integration of the DoD and the VA. But if we're not engaging our service members, as you said, what difference is that really going to make? So how do we engage our service members so that they know or are aware of the benefits that they have and the medical services that they're entitled to when they leave active duty service?
question is right on point. I actually have the benefit of having been the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness, and was able, with the permission of the Secretary of Defense, to put in place the most comprehensive DoD to VA transition program that the department has ever had, in cooperation with the VA, so that we begin educating our service members in the year before they tell us that they will be departing, on the benefits that they will receive, the future in the VA, but more importantly, given the health issues that we've addressed today, educating them on issues like PTSD, educating them on mental health issues, educating them on the signs for suicide and opioid addiction, educating them for the first time, and this is a VA issue as well, on financial stability. One of the things that I was very proud to implement was that, particularly when it comes to, I'll use our young Marines, most Marines don't spend 20 years in the service. They're out after 6 or 7 because of the operational tempo. They would leave service with nothing in the bank. We now, from the time they enter boot camp, are educating them on their financial future, and what they can expect, and allowing them now to participate in the thrift savings plan so they leave with something. So you are absolutely on target. I think the DoD is in a much better place than it was, and I'll let Dr. Stone talk about the health, because that's where we need to continue to make inroads.
Trying to get the veteran or the soon-to-become veteran to say yes, to come to see us, is the great difficulty. In the Vietnam-era veteran, we stood up 300 vet centers, which are small storefronts, mainly with behavioral health and assistance to make it easier to use our systems in order to come in and to get to yes. We need to evolve the vet centers to make them welcoming places for the post-9/11 generation. And I'm quite proud of the role that leadership of the vet centers is doing in order to do that. But moving from a cohesive military unit where an individual feels tremendously connected to coming out into a deeply disconnected civilian population creates huge risk for our veterans. And engaging early, engaging often, and then creating ease of transition by whatever means necessary is exactly what we must be doing.
Yeah. You know, I feel too often the emphasis is put on the veteran to go and seek out the support rather than the VA being open to, like, we need you to come in. So how do we change that scenario?
So let me just say to you that I mentioned earlier the suicide risk amongst Guard and Reserve. The Guard and Reserve leadership has allowed our mobile vet centers to come into their drill weekends to begin to reach out. We're also interacting with Human Resources Command across the services in order to find ways to reach out to more distant retired or out of uniform personnel.
And I would say, sir, that we have to rethink and repackage the way we look at military service. I will say, whenever I'm approached or asked, that VA is on one end of the national security continuum. I quoted General Eisenhower at the beginning. I don't think we've made that clear, that we're part of that national security world, and what DoD is doing now is something that it probably should have done many decades ago, but now that we're beginning at that end, I think veterans will be much better off.
Yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Muser.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you as well, Dr. Rowe. Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for being here. Dr. Stone, Really appreciate it, finding this very informative, and really appreciate your obvious high level of knowledge and dedication to our veterans and the Veterans Administration. So thank you. I come from Pennsylvania, the 9th Congressional. We relatively rural area. We very fortunately, though, I think the best district in the country. We've got 85,000 veterans that I'm fortunate to have in the district. We are served by the Lebanon VA, which tends to rank pretty high, does very well. The Wilkes-Barre VA is right outside my district, but many constituents do go there, and they do a fine job as well. We do have Fort Indian Town Gap, so we have many military personnel and veterans from that within the district. The Tobiana Army Depot is right outside my district, so it's very much of a military area. Many military families are touched by the VA. The Lebanon VA has done a great job. It's really a center for innovation. It has many vets in there on a regular basis, even for social reasons, which is really nice. They've done an excellent job in really cultivating and maintaining strong community relationships, and that is something, frankly, that I strongly encourage for the local VAs to become part of the community, as businesses do in other hospitals, because it really works out for them. They bring in a lot of state and local officials, primarily the Lebanon VA, the VSOs and such, other non-governmental agencies. So they really do a nice job. The veterans there are very satisfied. I'd say very satisfied, as it ranks high with the healthcare services. Now, many do go to more local community doctors for special services, and closer to where they live. And just in response to the proposed 60-minute drive distance, is the VA planning to improve the space leasing process? Because I understand that can be a little cumbersome. So local VA facilities can increase their points of access, or is it the idea to contract for care throughout the community, or a combination of the two?
Thank you, sir. I want to say, we were talking earlier about the projections and the movement of the veterans population through 2040. Pennsylvania is a constant in the top 10. So what you said is indicative of the entire state. You just hit on something that is part of the new way of looking at this. As Dr. Rowe has said, we're getting away from the construction of new hospitals. I mean, there have been some in the pipeline. We're getting care that's closer to home. This Congress has afforded us the opportunity to finally close the circle on family caregivers and their support. Leasing is important. I mentioned Fayetteville, North Carolina. 2 massive VA facilities in Fayetteville, 2,000 new veterans a month coming into the Fayetteville VA. The new facility is leased. I mean, it's so big that we have golf carts that bring in people from the parking lot. But by leasing it, our people can focus on the needs of the veterans, not cutting the grass and those kinds of daily things that make a building work. So that use mix has to be part of the future. And as Dr. Rowe has pointed out, the days, I'll say it, the days of us building a $4 billion hospital have to be a thing of the past.
We do feel, and I'm going to come back to the lifetime commitment we have to the American veteran. There are certain disease processes that are so complex. For instance, prostate cancer, one of the most common cancers in the American male, is unusually more aggressive in the American veteran, especially the Vietnam-era veteran. We therefore have entered into a relationship with the Prostate Cancer Foundation and the National Cancer Institute in order to provide state-of-the-art germ cell testing as well as precision oncology to the 12,000 veterans that we diagnose with prostate cancer each year. So we certainly see ourselves buying certain care in the community because it's convenient or it's in a rural area, but those are transactions of health care. We think that the full understanding of the American veteran should remain with the veterans' health care system, and especially in areas like prostate cancer and other solid cancers are things that we ought to be in the center of.
Chairman, thank you. I yield, but I would look forward to having a conversation. I hope that's available. Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from the Northern Mariana Islands, Mr. Sablan.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Takano and Ranking Member Rowe for holding today's hearing, looking into the future of the State of Veterans Affairs Department. Because for me, I mean, at least we have some luxury of looking to the future, but for me and the veterans I serve, we're looking at today's. I'm from the Northern Mariana Islands, so distant away. I think during Columbus time, they said that if you travel the ocean, then you would come to a cliff. Where I'm from is that cliff that goes on. That's how far away. But, you know, as we look ahead to a vision for the enhancement in care and services we will deliver our veterans 10 years, 20 years into the future and beyond, I want to call your attention to a particular underserved segment of our veteran population, those living in the U.S. islands, including my district, the Northern Mariana Islands. Our men and women from the islands have long served our country honorably in peacetime and war throughout history and across the globe. Yet when we return home, when they return home after service, they do not have access to full range of veterans benefits they have earned. When I got into office, we didn't even have a fee-based clinic for our veterans. I made that come to being, and so what can the VA do now, and what does the VA intend to do over the next 10 years to ensure that veterans in the insular areas are remembered and fully included in the VA's transformation?
The remoteness in the areas you described so adeptly are challenge in many areas. Yours is certainly unique. We do have clinics on a couple of the islands, but certainly areas like Saipan continue to challenge us. We have contracted with commercial contractors in that area, but continually look forward to the time when we might be able to operate a fully encompassing VA clinic, and that the demand will drive that. In addition to that, the inability to provide specialty care to remote veterans is a continuing challenge, resulting in the robust specialty care work across more than 50 specialties that we offer out of our both our Hawaii-based system as well as the rest of the delivery system. That said, there are still times that veteran must be transported across the ocean in order to get to care. We have also asked our contractor to provide rotating circuit rider services across the system. And as we bid the Region 5 and 6 in Alaska and in the Pacific, that will be one of the requirements, is the ability to provide services more robustly to your constituency.
And I would say, sir, and I mentioned it earlier, and it's something I feel no community in America serves at a higher percentage. No community in America has a higher percentage of Medal of Honor holders. And I'm committed to do everything that we can to make sure that we don't have an underserved population, and then that the service of your veterans recognized with the best care that we can give.
I very much appreciate this. I'm going to run out of time, so I will submit some questions, Mr. Secretary, and thank you for John. But my one, if I may comment, my last comment, During your testimony before the MilCon VA Appropriations Subcommittee hearings, I think yesterday, you mentioned plans to visit the Pacific later this year. Yeah, trust me, the ship won't fall down that cliff anymore. But I hope your plans include a visit to the Northern Marianas so you can meet our veterans and see for yourself the need for VA care and services in our islands. We'll have I have named advisory committees of veterans. You meet them, you meet other veterans, and if you could just comment.
Yes, sir. I believe I'll be out with you in May. I think that's right. What I mentioned yesterday was I was astonished. I was told I was the first VA secretary to visit the big island of Hawaii.
Well, you will be the first VA secretary.
I want to make sure that there are no more firsts. So I believe that I'm on the schedule to come out in May or June.
Thank you very much. And I have questions that I will submit for asking. Thank you. I yield back my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Watkins, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Mr. Secretary and Dr. Stone, for your leadership, your commitment to veterans, and your professionalism. I'm glad to join this committee. I look forward to working with you as well as my Democrat and Republican colleagues to get you what you need to succeed. I requested and was granted the opportunity to contribute to your efforts to modernize your technology. And your goals, I believe, will only be met if electronic health records are modernized. I represent Eastern Kansas, so we've got Topeka, Leavenworth, 55,000 veterans, including myself. I get my medical care at the Topeka VA, and veterans need great quality and access to health care and a seamless experience from their active duty or National Guard reserves to their veteran experience, and I think EHR is how that's done. So we're here to talk VA 2030. So has the VA yet quantified the goals and benefits expected from the new EHR modernization program, especially over the long term? So, for example, health outcomes, fewer redundant tests between DoD and VA, greater provider efficiency.
I appreciate this question because it really goes to the heart of this whole modernization effort. The ability to use data for future health outcomes requires that data be accessible and we be able to data mine it on even using artificial intelligence. And when you look out to 2030 or 2040, that data shouldn't wait for me to be smart enough to ask the question of the data. There should be data mining that moves things forward now. As a physician, I'm used to every time I type a medication in for a patient, a pop-up coming up of, oh, by the way, you're allergic to this medicine. The future is that data pop-up ought to include your genetic typing that predicts risk of either disease processes or reactions to medications. Our Million Veteran program has already turned up over 200 medications that are used for other things that may be usable in future hypertension work with veterans. So the future of this program and the success of it is essential over these ensuing years, and it's mostly about how we will use the data in the future for the benefit of individual veterans.
Thank you, Dr. Stone. Mr. Chairman, I yield my time.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Allred, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary and Dr. Stone, for being here and for your excellent and informative answers and for the hard work that I know you're putting in. I represent Texas and Dallas, Texas, and Texas has the, as you probably know, the second most veterans in the country of any state, and we have nearly 500,000 veterans who live in the North Texas region that are serviced by our VA hospital there, which is one of the largest in the country. I had the opportunity to visit that facility. I saw some incredible work going on there with some dedicated folks. They had wearable robotics that were allowing veterans to walk for the first time in years that I was just blown away by. Great child care for veterans who come in, who have kids and want to have their kids watched while they're getting the service that they need. But that market is growing extremely rapidly, as with many of the markets that I know we've talked about today. In fact, the estimate that I've seen is that it's the 10th fastest growing market is the North Texas region for veterans. And we have some of the problems that go along with that. And there's an estimate here that says that we have a shortage of inpatient beds. Has resulted in as many as 75 veterans each day waiting for a bed at our local VA. And in an attempt to address that, there's a local hospital that they're trying to acquire in my district, and it would be the only VA facility in the northern part of Dallas, in the northern part of my area, and they're working hard to do that. And this hospital would provide an additional 180 beds for VA patients and as many as 2,000 additional jobs in my district. And it's a priority for me, and I think that Senator Cornyn has also reached out to you about this, and I think that there's going to be some bipartisan support for this. And I just wanted to know if you would commit today to working with me and working with us to get this project across the line.
Well, let me first start by saying the projections that we discussed about looking out to 2030 and 2040, and I don't mean this as any slight to the chairman, is that Texas passes California between 2030 and 24 in terms of the number of veterans. Before I let Dr. Stone answer, I've been to Dallas. I've talked to the leadership about the hospital purchase and expansion, and I've talked to Senator Cornyn. So you have my commitment to work on that in light of what is happening in Texas, and I'll let Dr. Stone finish.
We may be short as much as 1 million square feet in your market, and we can't move fast enough to get this done. This looks like a really exciting opportunity. We had the engineers out looking at that facility. The local leadership has said, gee, with a coat of paint, we'd be ready to go. Want to make sure that that's correct. In addition, the Secretary is advised by a public-private partnership advisor. We've had her out looking at that and engaged in it, as well as we've brought our Chief of Acquisition, Karen Brazil, into this discussion and her team to try and see how we could move and make sure we do it properly. That said, every day we have the problem of referring people out that we should be able to keep in the system. So it's an exciting time, and we welcome your partnership in this, but we've got everybody engaged in it, and I look forward to engaging you and the Secretary as we work our way through this.
Yeah. Well, thank you. My office we're going to be working with you closely on this. We want to make sure we can get this across the line, and if there's anything we can do to help you in that process, I hope you will feel free to reach out to us. And as I said, I think it's a win-win. It's a kind of an obvious thing, I think. Very quickly, I just wanted to touch base with you on veterans homelessness. I had the honor of working in the Obama administration at the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and we tried to put a focus on ending veterans homelessness and putting a significant dent in that through some of the programs that we initiated. And I've seen some news reports saying that in 2017 we had a slight increase in homelessness, in 2018 a reduction. I just wanted to see where we are in terms of work now and what we can do as a Congress to help you to continue to combat veterans homelessness.
Absolutely. The good news is that 10 years ago, there were 400,000 veterans on the street. The bad news is there are less than 100,000, but that's still bad news. I have a wonderful relationship with Secretary Carson. I was mentioning earlier my impressions from Southern California. And I will say again, I think the saddest sight that I've seen, Mr. Chairman, let me ask your indulgence, was watching cars come into West Los Angeles, and they're veterans in the cars at night. They all have jobs. They all contribute to Los Angeles County. They contribute to the tax base. They're doing what is expected of them, and they can't get housing. In that case, I was very happy to engage with the mayor of Los Angeles, Mayor Garcetti. We've got an understanding on how we're going to increase transitional housing. The other part of this is what I've seen in terms of the change of homelessness in the homeless population, different from what I saw in Los Angeles, is that we're now seeing more single American women with families who are homeless. So we've asked for, we will ask for more money. So is HUD for the transition, for supporting services for families, for homeless, and we need a more robust relationship with the localities to help us find those folks.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired, and Mr. Secretary, our time together is coming to a close. Thank you for your willingness to answer so many questions and bear with us as we went through our votes. I wanted to say there's no offense taken about the truth about the number of Texas veterans that we are seeing down the pipeline. In fact, I'm very grateful that Mr. Allred decided to join the committee. We recruited him. He sort of serves on 2 committees, and we knew that we needed representation from Texas on the committee because of the number of veterans, and we wanted to make sure that there was somebody, a point person, that would advocate for them and advocate for their needs. Mr. Secretary, I look forward to working with you. We intend to invite the person that you had mentioned, you have appointed a point person inside your department on veteran suicide. We hope that they'll join us at our
March 6th.
our roundtable.
Yes, they're
And
coming.
I hope we can pull together a hearing of some principal folks. My intention is not to inflame the moment. I understand how complicated addressing this issue is. It's complicated, and we know the VA has made tremendous strides and is improved its mental health offerings significantly. But there are times when the VA may fall down, but there's other complexities that we need to solve together as members of Congress. And I pledge to you and the American people that Dr. Rowe and I are going to work together as a team on this issue of combating veteran suicide. I want to give Dr. Rowe a moment to say a few final words, and then we'll adjourn.
Well, I'm sorry Mr. Allred left. Being from Texas, Tennessee has a history of taking care of Texas, and we would have taken care of them whether vets there or not. And Dr. Stone, I want to thank you for your uplifting comments about Vietnam-era veterans like myself that had a more aggressive form of prostate cancer. That leaves me feeling much better since I was treated for that about a year and a half ago, so thank you for uplifting me. One of the challenges that the VA has, and Mr. Allred and all the California folks were all on it, is the challenges there are, I just looked it up, and the average home price in Los Angeles is $828,000. I've been to West LA and been through what they're doing. They're trying very hard there to help take care of the veteran homelessness. The average lease is $4,000 a month. The average home price where I live is $148,000, and that's the wealthiest county in my district of 12. So it gives you an idea about your money goes a lot further. That may have something to do with why veterans are moving to the south and somewhat to the west. But there are unique challenges, no question about it, in California, where 10% of all the homeless veterans in America live in one county. So I applaud you for trying to do something there, and it is heart-wrenching to see a veteran who served this country that's working for a living out there trying and cannot live in a home. I look forward, Mr. Takano, I know Chairman Takano, you have set a good mark for the committee. I think we have a lot to do. Mr. Secretary and Dr. Stone, thank you all both for being here, very forthright. We again apologize for having to go vote and leave you all sitting here, but we appreciate the time, the enormous amount of time you spent with us this afternoon, and look forward to working with you all during this Congress. And I yield back.
Thank you for your courtesy. Thank you very much, both of you.
All members will have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials. Again, thank you, Secretary Wilkie. I wish you a quick recovery, and this hearing is now adjourned.